This is a story words could never hold gently enough. High in the Smoky Mountains in the year 1872, with the war barely cold in the ground, survival was never only about the flood that came every autumn or the long hunger of winter. Sometimes the deadliest thing a body had to outlast was the man who sat at the head of her own table. This is the story of a girl beaten down by her own blood, and the widowed mountain man who taught her how to stand back up. Coster's Mill was a town that had outlived its reason for being. The mill wheel had thrown a spoke 3 summers back and never turned true again, and the men who'd come for the timber and the tobacco stayed only because leaving cost money they didn't have. The houses leaned, the dogs were thin, and on the muddy lane that passed for a main street, folks had learned the useful art of looking the other way. They looked the other way at Cora Tillett most of all. She was 20 years old that fall, a girl made of careful silences and downcast eyes, with a bruise on her cheekbone that faded yellow only long enough for a fresh one to bloom over it. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and her father, Ezekiel Tillett, had never once let her forget who he blamed for it. Zeke had been a tobacco man before the leaf rotted in the fields, and he was a moonshiner now, which is to say he drank more of his own corn liquor than he ever sold. When he looked at Cora, he did not see a daughter. He saw the doctor's bill, the empty bed, the wife the Lord had taken, and the child the Lord had been careless enough to leave behind. His cruelty was not the hot, blind kind. It was patient. It had rules. If the cornbread came out heavy, he used the flat of his hand. If she let the fire die to coals before he woke, he reached for the harness strap that hung on its nail by the door, the one he kept oiled supple for the purpose. Cora had learned to move through her own home like a draft of cold air, to eat standing up, to read the weather of his mouth before he ever said a word. The town knew. Mrs. Eudora Sykes at the store would weigh out Cora's meal and salt and find something fascinating to study on the far shelf while she did it. Reverend Pettigrew, who rode the circuit through 3 Hollows, liked to catch Cora at the well and remind her in his soft voice that a daughter's duty was patience and a forgiving heart, and he had never once in 20 years said the like to her father. And Constable Briggs, who was supposed to be the law, drank his whiskey free at Holly's Drennan's account and kept his eyes on the bottom of the glass. So Cora did not run. The mountains went on forever in every direction, dark and wet and full of teeth, and the only road out led down past men who'd nod and tip their hats and send her right back home. She had stopped praying for a rescuer somewhere around her 13th winter. Hope, she had decided, was just one more thing that could be taken from you. It was a raw Thursday in October when the shape of her life first cracked. Zeke had hauled her down to the mill store to load sacks of meal onto the wagon, and he sat up on the buckboard with a jug between his knees, calling out which sack to lift next while 2 loafers on the store porch laughed along. Cora's hands were split and bleeding inside thin gloves. On the 4th sack her boot slid in the mud, and the sack went down, and the seam burst, and good meal poured out gray into the muck. The laughing stopped. Zeke came down off the wagon with his face gone the color of a bruise, and his hand was already at his belt. Cora did the thing her body had learned to do. She folded down small, arms over her head, and waited for the bite of the leather. It did not come. A shadow fell across her, wide as a barn door. She opened one eye to see a man standing between her and her father, a big man in a faded gray coat that might once have been a soldier's, with a beard going silver at the chin and a long carbine resting easy in the crook of one arm. His eyes were the color of a storm coming over the ridge, and there was no fear anywhere in them. This was Eli Calloway. He lived alone high up on Saddleback Ridge and came down to the mill only twice a year for powder and salt, and the children of Coster's Mill scared each other with stories about him. "The girl slipped," Eli said. His voice was low and worn like a creak over stone. Zeke's mouth worked. "She's my blood, Calloway. I'll correct my own kin how I please. Stand aside." "She slipped," Eli said again, and he did not move, and his thumb came up and drew back the heavy hammer of the Spencer with a sound that carried clean across the silent street. For a long moment the only sound was the wind in the bare branches. Then Zeke spat into the mud, buckled his belt back, and jabbed a shaking finger at his daughter. "Get on the wagon." As Cora climbed up, trembling, she looked back once, and for just a heartbeat the storm in the mountain man's eyes broke, and what showed underneath it was something she had no name for, because no one had ever pointed it at her before. It was pity, and it was something steadier than pity. He said nothing, but Cora rode home that day carrying a single ember she'd thought long dead, the smallest, most dangerous spark of hope. She paid for it that night. Zeke locked the cabin door and used the strap until his arm tired, screaming that she'd shamed him in front of the whole town, made him small before a half-wild hermit who lived with the bears. When he was done, he left her curled in the corner with her ribs aching and her lips split, and he drank himself to sleep in his chair. The ember did not go out. It only burned lower and waited. 3 days later, a man on a black horse came up the trace to the Tillett cabin, and Cora's life turned on its hinge. Holly's Drennan owned the better part of the valley below Saddleback. The mortgages, the store's debts, the note on the Tillett land itself, which Zeke had signed away one whiskey at a time. He was a smooth, heavy man in a good coat, with a silver-headed cane he did not need and a way of smiling that never reached his eyes. He had buried 2 wives that anyone knew of. He came into the cabin without knocking and sat himself down at the table like he owned the chair, which, in a manner of speaking, he did. Cora made herself small behind the rough partition wall and listened. "Your note's long past due, Zeke," Drennan said, easy as Sunday. "Land still, cabin, it's all mine to take when I please, and you know it, but I'm a reasonable man." A pause and the creak of his chair. "You've got a daughter, grown, strong-backed by the look of her. I find myself in want of a wife to keep my house. You sign her over to me and I'll burn that note in your own stove tonight. Clean slate." The silence stretched. Cora pressed her hand to her mouth. "Take her," her father said. There was not one breath of hesitation in it. "Lord knows she eats more than she's worth." "I'll send my men up at the end of the week," Drennan said, and she heard the smile in it. "Have her washed and ready." Cora's blood went to ice. She knew what manner of man Drennan was. The women in the valley spoke of his first 2 wives in the low voices kept for things that ought to be buried. Whatever waited for her in that big house down the valley would make her father's strap look like a kindness. She had to run. There was nothing left to lose by running, and everything to lose by staying. She waited until the dark hours, until her father had drunk himself sideways in his chair with the jug rising and falling on his chest. Outside, the sky had opened up. An autumn storm rolled down off the high peaks, fat cold rain that hissed in the chimney and set the gullies running, and below the cabin she could already hear the river starting to talk louder than it should. She moved like a hunted thing. She took her father's heavy coat off its peg, and his skinning knife, and the flint and steel from the mantel, and she wrapped her feet in sacking tied with twine. Then she went out the back window into the howling black. She did not go down toward the mill. The mill meant Drennan, meant Briggs, meant being handed back like a stray. Instead she turned her face toward the worst, steepest, most dangerous country she knew, up, toward Saddleback Ridge and the man who had stood between her and the strap. She did not know if he would take her in or run her off his land with a load of buckshot. She only knew the look in his eyes, and that it was the one thing in this world she had left to walk toward. The climb was a nightmare. The rain came sideways and the cold of it got into her bones and stayed there. The little creeks that crossed the trace had swollen to brown torrents that grabbed at her knees and tried to carry her down to the river. Her ribs screamed with every step. By the second hour she could not feel her hands. The world narrowed to the next root, the next rock, the next gasping breath. And then, through the roar of the water, she heard a sound that lit her veins with fire, the deep, baying call of hounds on a trail, somewhere down the slope behind her. Drennan had not waited for the end of the week. He had loosed his dogs. She crawled the last of it. When the low square shape of a log cabin finally rose out of the rain, a single orange thread of firelight leaking from one shutter. She had nothing left to stand on. She dragged herself up the porch steps and clawed at the heavy door with fingers that no longer obeyed her. "Please," she whispered, and the storm took the word away. Then the dark came up and swallowed her whole. Inside, Eli Calloway sat by his hearth with a pan of honey warming on the stones, drawn that morning from the hives he kept under the eaves, the one sweet thing he allowed himself in a life he'd stripped down to bone. His old hound, Solomon, lifted his graying head and went rigid, a low growl rolling up out of his chest toward the door. Eli set down his cup. He took the Spencer from its pegs, slid the door bolt, and pulled the door open against the wind. A snow of cold rain blew in. At his feet lay a sodden, half-frozen shape. He knelt, brushed the wet hair back, and knew her at once, the girl from the mill store. She was the color of ash, her lips gone blue, her breath so shallow he had to put his cheek near her mouth to find it. He had no time to lift her. Out of the white roar 3 figures came stumbling up out of the timber, lantern lights swinging, guns in their fists. Zeke was one of them, and Drennan's hired men Tate and Cleve, soaked through and furious. "Step off her, Calloway," Zeke bellowed over the wind. "She's stolen property, and she's coming back down this mountain with me." Eli did not answer right away. He reached down with one long arm and dragged Cora's limp body across the threshold, behind him, into the warm. Then he straightened, stepped to the very edge of the porch, and let the rain run down his face. He brought the Spencer up level and laid the sight on the broad center of Zeke Tillett's chest. "You're trespassing on my ridge, Tillett," he said, and his voice cut through the storm clean as a blade. "Both of you." "I got the law behind me," Zeke shouted, but his voice cracked, and he glanced sideways at the hired men for backbone. "The law ends at the tree line up here." Eli's thumb came back on the hammer with that same flat, final click. "You take one more step toward my door, and I'll leave the 3 of you for the river. And there ain't a flood on this mountain rises high enough to carry a man far enough that what's left of him won't be found come spring." Tate and Cleve looked at the size of him, and the steadiness of that long barrel, and the black water roaring in the gullies, and their enthusiasm for the work drained out through their boots. Zeke's gun wavered. Eli's finger settled on the trigger. It was Drennan's man Tate who broke it. "River's coming up fast, Mr. Tillett. We don't get back across the ford now. We don't get back at all." Zeke cursed every name he could lay tongue to. He backed down off the slope, gun still half raised. "When the river drops, Calloway," he called up through the rain, "Mr. Drennan's coming for what's owed him. You and the girl both." Then the dark folded them up and they were gone. Eli lowered the carbine. He stepped back inside, dropped the bar across the door, and stood a long moment looking down at the broken girl on his hearthstones. Her coat had fallen open, and in the firelight he could see the dark purple bruising that mapped her collarbone and her throat, old hurt over old hurt over old hurt. His jaw went hard as oak. 5 years he had spent building this place into a fortress, a high cold wall against a world that took everything a man loved. And now the world had crawled up his mountain in the rain and lain down dying on his floor. He knelt, and he felt for her pulse, and he knew the long quiet of his life was over. For 3 days and 3 nights Cora hung between the world and the dark. The flood raged below and shut the ridge off from everything, and inside the cabin Eli fought to keep her on the near side of it. He brewed bitter willowbark tea and spooned it past her cracked lips, and he stirred dark honey into it from his hives until she could keep it down. He laid poultices of comfrey and pine pitch over the worst of the bruising on her ribs. When the fever climbed, he sat up all the night with a cool cloth, saying nothing, while Solomon lay heavy and warm against her side. When she came back to herself with a clear mind, she was lying on a thick tick of woven boughs and fur near a stone hearth, and a man sat at the table cleaning the parts of an old revolver. Cora flinched hard, hauling the furs up to her chin. In all her 20 years, a man in a room with her had meant exactly one thing. Eli did not look up. He worked the oiled rag along the steel. "Fever broke last night," he said, gruff and low. "There's venison and beans in the pot. Eat, or you'll fade clean away." "Why'd you not let them take me?" Her voice came out a dry rasp. He was quiet a while. He looked toward the shuttered window, toward the white roar beyond it. "A man who hands a lamb to the wolves," he said at last, "ain't a man at all. He's just a slower kind of wolf." Then he looked at her, and the storm in his eyes had gone soft. "You're safe on this ridge, Cora Tillett. Long as the water's up, nobody's coming." The flood held for a week, and then the rains eased, and a slow, careful thing began to grow between the ruined girl and the solitary man. Eli was no talker, but he never raised his voice, never moved sudden, never reached for her except to hand her a cup or steady her elbow on the ice. Day by day the bruises faded off her skin, and something deeper began to knit underneath. One evening, while he was carving a new handle for a hatchet, Cora noticed a small, worn box on the mantel. Inside lay a little carved wooden spoon, child-sized, and a faded tintype of a smiling woman with dark hair. "Naomi," Eli said without her asking, "and the baby was to come that next spring." He set the hatchet down. "We were crossing at the lower ford, fall of '67, the water high like now. Some men came out of the willows. Robbers, folks said after, took what the travelers had and pushed them into the current to be rid of the witnesses. I came up clear of it down river, half drowned, with nothing." He looked into the fire. "Never found her, just the spoon snagged in the brush. I built up here after. Couldn't abide the valley no more. Too loud, too full of men." "My father hated me for living," Cora said, so quiet he had to lean to hear it, "when my mother didn't. I was just the bill he had to pay every day." It was the first time in her life she had said it out loud, and saying it loosened something in her chest she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. Eli rose. He went to a chest in the corner and took out a second revolver, a balanced thing that sat easy in the hand, and he laid it on the table in front of her. "Water won't stay up forever," he said. "When it drops, Drennan comes. Drennan don't forgive a debt, and your father don't forgive being made small. You spent 20 years learning how to be a victim, Cora. I aim to teach you how to be a survivor." So the cabin became a school. Eli taught her to hold the pistol steady and squeeze rather than pull, to breathe out and fire between the heartbeats. He taught her to read a track in the mud, to set a snare, to move quiet through the laurel. And Cora changed under his hand. The hollow girl filled out, her arms hardened from splitting wood and hauling water, and the frightened darting went out of her eyes and left behind a flat, steady gray, like his own. Down in Coster's mill, a different storm was building. Holly's Drennan sat in the back of the store with Zeke Tillett across from him, and Zeke had a fresh black eye for his trouble. "The river's down enough to ford in a day or two," Drennan said, tapping the silver head of his cane against the floor. "And you, Tillett, have cost me dogs, men, and dignity. I want that mountain man dealt with, and I want the girl. So you'll tell me, right now, why a half-broke hermit is worth this much grief to you to leave alone." Zeke was drunk, and drunk men talk to save their own skins. "On account of what he is, Hollies," he slurred. "Folks don't recollect it, but I do. Calloway's the one man come up alive out of that lower ford the year your timber crew worked it, the only one. He's the one set of eyes that ever saw the faces of them river robbers and lived to put a name to 'em if ever he had a mind to." Zeke grinned, ugly and proud of his own cleverness. "You always did wonder if there was a witness left." The room went very still. Whatever was in Holly's Drennan's face then, it was no longer about a debt or a bride. It had gone cold and old, the look of a man who has just learned that a thing he buried 5 years deep has been breathing on a mountain above him the whole time. "When the ford's passable," he said softly, "we ride up Saddleback, and we leave nobody on it." The river dropped. The valley steamed under a thin late-autumn sun, and the lower ford ran shallow enough to cross. On a gray morning Cora was out by the woodpile, her breath smoking in the cold, the revolver riding easy on her hip and a coil of split kindling in her arms. For the first time in her life she felt the strange, light feeling of belonging somewhere. Then Solomon came boiling out from under the porch, hackles up, and let loose a string of deep, ringing barks down the slope. Eli was on the porch in 3 strides, the Spencer already in his hands. He looked once down the tree line and his face tightened. Inside, Cora, bar the shutters. What is it? Company. Up through the bare timber they came, Holly's Drennan on his black horse, with his silver cane and 2 hired guns flanking, and behind them Zeke Tillett, clutching an old shotgun and looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere on earth. Calloway, Drennan reined up at the edge of the clearing. We can do this easy. Send out the girl and stand still while my men do their work, and maybe it's quick. Eli stood behind the thick porch post. There's no dead up here that's yours to call, Drennan. The girl's free, and so am I. Turn those horses, or they go back down the mountain riderless. You don't even know what you are, do you? Drennan said, almost wondering. You're the last loose thread of a thing I sewed shut 5 years ago at the ford. I can't have loose threads. And he raised his pistol. Kill them both. The mountain came apart in gunfire. Lee chewed splinters off the logs. Eli fired, and his first shot took one of the hired men clean out of the saddle, dead in the mud before the echo rolled off the far ridge. Solomon launched himself at the second man and bore him down screaming, jaws on his gun arm, and the man dropped his rifle and fled down the slope with the hound at his heels. The clearing churned with smoke and shouting. But in the chaos, Cora lost sight of her father. And then the cabin's back door, the one that faced the steep drop, came in with a crash of splintered pine. Zeke stumbled through it, eyes wild, and saw her crouched by the cold stove and brought the shotgun up. You ungrateful little wretch, he snarled, finger trembling on the trigger. You done all this. You ruined me. Everything I ever had you took. For one heartbeat, the frightened child rose up in Cora and threatened to fold her down small. She looked at the man who had owned every terror of her life, and she saw, for the first time, that he was not a monster at all. He was small and pathetic and weak and drowning. She rose up slow from behind the stove. She brought the revolver up in both hands, steady as Eli had taught her, the sight settled on the center of his chest. Her voice, when it came, was so calm it startled even her. "Put it down, Zeke," she said. "You will not lay a hand on me ever again." He laughed, a cracked and ugly sound. "You ain't got the—" He never finished it. A shadow filled the broken doorway behind him. Holly's Drennan come around the cabin while his men kept Eli pinned. Drennan took in the bare, dirt-poor little room, the crude plank floor, the witness he'd ridden up to silence, and the drunk old fool he no longer had any use for. "You've been more trouble than your whole life is worth, Tillett," Drennan said, and he raised his pistol and shot Cora's father once through the chest. Zeke Tillett's eyes went wide with a child's surprise. He folded backward onto the planks and was dead before he settled. And Drennan stepped over him, swinging his pistol toward the door, toward the porch, toward Eli Calloway, who had just gone down on one knee in the doorway with red spreading dark across his coat sleeve, his Spencer empty, the loading tube hanging open with a soft, useless snick. Drennan smiled and thumbed back the hammer to finish the only witness to the ford. Cora did not think. 20 years of being made small and 3 weeks of being taught how to stand came together in the space of a single breath. She turned and fired. The roar of it filled the little room. Holly's Drennan staggered, the silver cane clattering from his hand, a look of pure astonishment on his face that a barefoot Milltown girl had been the loose thread that finally pulled him down. He took one step and went down across the threshold, half in and half out of the cabin, and did not move again. Then there was only the ringing quiet, and the smell of powder, and old Solomon limping back up onto the porch. Eli got himself up against the door frame, his arm hanging, and looked at her across the bodies on the floor. "Are you hit?" he breathed. Cora lowered the revolver. She looked down at her father and felt a great dizzy emptiness open in her, and then, behind it, rushing up like the river through the laurel, a feeling she had no practice at release. The long chain that had been cinched around her throat since she was 7 years old simply fell away. She crossed the room and pressed her face against Eli's good shoulder, and the tears came at last, not for sorrow, but because she was alive and she was safe, and for the first time she was both at once. They buried Zeke Tillett and Holly's Drennan down by the lower ford, where the water had taken so much already, under stones with no names cut into them. The hired man who'd run never came back, and the story he carried down to Coster's mill, of the mountain man and the gray-eyed girl who guarded Saddleback Ridge, was enough that no one from the valley ever rode up looking for either of them again. In time, the truth of the old Ford robbery worked its way through the hollows, and Naomi Calloway's name was finally spoken with the others who'd been pushed into that water and laid, in a manner, to rest. That next spring the bees came back to the hives under the eaves, and the honey ran amber and warm, and Eli's arm healed crooked but strong. Cora Tillett, the prisoner of Coster's mill, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had been put through the fire and the flood and had come out tempered. She had learned, up on that high cold ridge, the truest thing there is to know, that blood does not make a family, that a man can sit at the head of your table for 20 years and be nothing to you at all, and that the people who are yours are the ones who choose you when they had every reason to bar the door. She had also learned a colder truth, and never forgot it, that cruelty buried is cruelty only waiting, and that sooner or later, like everything sunk in a river, it rises. And Eli Calloway, who had walled his heart in stone 5 winters deep, found that some things, like the honey and the spring, will come back to a man, even up on the wildest, loneliest ridge in all the world, if only he can find it in himself to open the door. If Cora and Eli's story of survival, courage, and finding family in the harshest of places moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this with anyone who loves a tale of mountain grit, and subscribe for more gripping stories.